Let's do it.
Hello, my name's Sue Maslin, and I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respect to the traditional and the original owners and custodians of the land from which I'm streaming right now in Tasmania, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the Palawa, and I pay my respects on behalf of all of you to their elders, past, present and emerging. So welcome everybody to this session, Screen Forever, Australian Feature Films 2021 and beyond. I'm a screen producer, but I'm also a distributor. And together with other fellow producers, distributors, exhibitors and screen agencies over the last 3 years, we've been having an extended conversation about the future of Australian feature films. And there's absolutely no doubt that this is a volatile space, and it's probably one of the highest risk areas in the screen business, but also has the potential for highest reward as well. And it's changing. Right now, for all of us involved in this business, one thing has remained constant through all of these changes, and that is our commitment to continued, sustainable and successful Australian films at the box office going forward. And it's really this slate for Australia's audiences, feature films, moving forward into tomorrow's theatrical market that will be the focus of this session. But how do we create that success? How do we create that future? And that is what the focus of this session will be about and what we'll explore. So I'll be joined by fellow moderator Claire Gandy, who's General Manager of Event Cinemas, also by Joel Perlman, CEO of Roadshow Films, and Emile Sherman, who is Joint Managing Director of Seesaw Films. We'll be holding a conversation together over the next 30 minutes, and then we will open up to questions from the delegates and the audience. So we really, really hope that you'll throw in questions to us as the conversation progresses. But let's just start right now with where we find the Australian feature film business right now. And I thought a great scene setter for that would be a promo that Screen Australia put together towards the end of last year, which was aimed at celebrating our summer in cinema. So if we could roll that promo, please.
So you've heard some stories about me.
Tell me your secrets.
If we're gonna work together, you should learn to shoot.
I didn't think I was strong enough, but I am.
You think you're gonna get the truth in a town like this?
Go! I'm here. I'm your mum. Say mum.
Whatever made you think you could change who you are?
It was time to have a black company in Australia.
What are you doing?
You lied. Say it.
I was struggling.
Oh, you're struggling.
It's all of us.
You stand for justice?
Absolutely. Depends on you.
What an incredible lineup. And there's absolutely no doubt that Australian audiences are embracing our films with gusto at the moment. So much so that we find ourselves in the unprecedented situation that this weekend just passed 4 of the top 5 of all box office releases at the moment in Australian cinemas are, in fact, Australian films. Never happened before. Quite extraordinary. Laurie Flexer and MPDAA actually have put together a few slides, which I would like to share with you now, just to give you a sense of the scale of this success. So you'll see listed here, and all hats off to Roadshow for the top 2 positions, Joel. The Dry and Penguin Bloom, extraordinary result over the weekend. And in fact, it looks like The Dry is well on the way to a $20 million box office, which will make it again in that group of the all-time highest grossing Australian films. But we also have Penguin Bloom, Long Story Short, and High Ground. So to date, this year, so in 2021, this group of films, the Australian films that have been released, has actually generated 54% of the gross box office. If we just jump to the next slide, please. So out of a total of 70 films released, 11 of those have been Australian, generating a total box office of 26 million, which, despite the fact that we're 16% of the total number of films in cinemas, we're actually generating right now 54% of gross box office. Let's just take a quick look at those films that are currently have been released in this year. So Todd, thank you. Just to give us a little bit of context though, we need to acknowledge that Hollywood is absent from this market, and it's also been greatly impacted by COVID and the restrictions last year. So if we just cut to the next slide, we'll just take a look at that impact. Because, so yeah, if we can just go to the next slide, please. You'll see in 2020, the fact that gross box office was down by more than 65% in aggregate. So we have a very, very different environment that we're releasing into at the moment. But on the bright side, if we cut to the next slide, it actually has resulted in an opportunity for local releases to jump into this market. And in fact, where you can see that our average share of box office is way, way above what the long-term share of box office has been. So it's sort of unprecedented situation. I was actually one of the distributors. Film Art Media was one of those who jumped into this space last year. And we took that risk with the release of our documentary, Brazen Hussies. And I know for a fact that our box office and the fact we went out on 53 screens nationally was way in excess of what would be the normal result for a social issues documentary like Brazen Hussies. In fact, it was more than triple, what we had estimated. So let's talk about this environment. And I'm going to throw my first question to Joel, actually. And as somebody who has driven the success of both Dry and Penguin Bloom, what do you make of the current theatrical environment? And would these films have performed as well were it not for the lack of Hollywood releases in this market?
So I think the current theatrical environment is very challenged for the reasons that you articulated before, namely that there is a substantial lack of volume in cinemas due to the fact that the traditional Hollywood films that were set to release now and have been set to release for many months have been moved to much later in the year until the world recovers from COVID. We exist in a global environment, and as such, the lack of those films is having a real impact, particularly for exhibitors, and frankly for a lot of distributors who had films like those slated for release during this corridor. But it must be said that it has created a real environment for local cinema all over the world. I think it's not just here. We saw a Chinese film released in China over the weekend and take $165 million on its opening day. The reality is there have been opportunities for local productions in environments which have returned to more of a COVID normal existence. And, frankly, Australia is still far from that. I mean, the films that have released during this corridor have still had to deal with closures. I mean, Melbourne, as we all know, is coming out of lockdown tonight. There have been closures in Perth. There have been closures in Sydney. So it hasn't been an easy environment to release in. But there has been this opportunity to release these films during this corridor. I would say, to your question earlier about would these films have succeeded were it not for COVID, the answer is absolutely yes. The Dry was originally scheduled for release in August, and we took the opportunity to move it into the summer corridor as we realised that Australia would be relatively normalised, and the same for New Zealand, where it's performed as well. Penguin Bloom was always scheduled for January. It was always committed to January long before COVID ever happened. And we had always seen these films as major releases. I think it's fair to say no one would ever predict a $17 to $20 million result for a production. So certainly the Dry has exceeded all of our expectations. But these films were going to work wherever they went. But what they've had the opportunity to do is have this very long tail where the Dry is still, I think we're week 7 going into week 8, still the #1 film in the country. That's unusual.
So it's meant access to screens, and we don't have, a James Bond or a, Star Wars or an Avengers, sucking the oxygen out of all screens. So it's demonstrated to exhibitors an appetite, if you like, for Australian film. I'd love to throw to Claire and just ask you, what do you make of the current situation and audience engagement? And are we having a revived love affair, audiences, a love affair with Australian cinema?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't be happier that we've had this opportunity to highlight Australian films in cinemas. And I think it's something that Australian cinemas and cinema operators have wanted for a long time. We communicate with our audience all the time, and 98% of our audience would highly recommend The Dry, that's almost 100%. It's unheard of. And this is, since we've been tracking that sort of information, there's been a huge amount of positive WOM on all the Australian films that we've been screening. And it's a testament to the fact that The Dry is still the #1 film. The drop-off has been minimal. And it's got like a 4.6 out of 5 rating from our audience. So it's, I think it is a huge indication that Australians are more than capable of making high quality, interesting, engaging, broad films for audiences. And it's great that we've had this opportunity. I think when we were speaking before, one of the questions I've been asked a lot about the Australian films in the market is, would they have gotten this box office success if it wasn't during this period? Absolutely, they would have. They might not have been released on those same dates. They're obviously, we talk regularly with distributors around dating, but they absolutely would have still achieved this amazing amount of success. So I think there's this revitalised feeling amongst audiences for Australian content and Australian product, and this is a huge opportunity. And I think Matt Dina said it in his opening speech, to get our house in order so that we can, like with China, huge, they have had a record weekend in the history of their cinema, and same with Japan, had a record opening of one of their films, Demon Slayer. So it's a testament to the fact that we have the talent and ability locally to be able to produce these films. So I absolutely want more of it and more often.
So it would seem to suggest that exhibitors are probably warming to Australian films and their potential, like right at the moment, and certainly making screens available in a way that far exceed normal circumstances. So what do you think we can learn from this going forward? And will distributors like Joel and others be able to get the screens, particularly for some of the more independent or difficult Australian films going forward, and not just the obvious crowd pleasers?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, dating is hugely important, and everyone is talking about the fact that all the Hollywood films just keep pushing and further into the year. And Joel made this point very eloquently when we were chatting earlier, that saying there'll probably be less of those films, which means that creates an opportunity for Australian distributors and Australian filmmakers to actually fill those gaps. And also, I think my job is to try and broaden the palette of the general public, the general audience of Australia. Independent cinemas, which I have a history with as well, are really great at embracing independent, small, low-budget Australian films. And the broader audience sometimes are a little bit more hesitant to do that. And this is a great opportunity for those smaller films to find a bigger audience with our help. And certainly we're not going to forget our friends during this period. You know, there's been some distributors who have been extremely supportive for cinemas and have released films with our support. We've partnered with lots of distributors and filmmakers to get films done during this period, and it's kept a lot of people employed. So that's a huge deal for the industry, and you know, it's a very precarious situation out there right now. There's not a huge amount happening in terms of releases at the moment. There's a bit of a lull, but we're open and we're still pushing the same films that we've got because they're amazing. Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. Yep.
Well, actually, I might throw this one to Emil, because this sounds like there's more opportunity for those of us that do want to make quality Australian films, and it sounds like the exhibitors want the supply. How do you, Emil, respond to the fact that we're now facing a shift in legislation, and most notably the change in the producer offset from 40% down to 30%, with the deliberate intent to reduce the number of feature films that are being produced each year?
Thanks, Sue. Well, I mean, I don't read too much into the current situation, aside from what I've always believed, which is that Australians love really good Australian movies. They always have. Whenever there are good Australian films, we get the support generally of the distribution and exhibition communities because they believe that there are audiences for them, and they perform really well. They always perform generally better here than they perform overseas, and so it just makes me feel more and more strongly, and it's a great motivating moment to know that once again we see Australians going out to see Australian cinema. The shift in the legislation obviously is coinciding with a real big pivotal moment in the content industry. And I mean, we're just in a great moment for content generally. I think you have to step back a little bit and look at the industry overall, the rise of the SVODs, this sort of incredible moment for television, the way that film and television are almost, you know, touching, in a sense that an SVOD 2-hour movie, how different is that from a miniseries that's on a Netflix or a Stan? What are really the lines, and letting go of the theatrical nature to get the offset, I think, is important, because it helps us realize that we are moving to a merged world. Where theatrical sits, I think, is a really open question, and I think we're all rooting for theatrical as an ongoing and key part of the landscape and audience experience, and I believe it will continue to be that. My concerns with the legislation are really, you know, I think it's great for television. The 40% to 30%, 40% was never enough to begin with. We knew that for Australian films. So we always had Screen Australia for Australian movies to be able to top up. So I think really Screen Australia will need to increase their investments on the projects that they decide to back to supplement the reduction. The bigger, so that feels obvious to me. It's just unlikely we're going to be in a landscape where suddenly 10% is going to be found. I think the level of films, what constitutes theatrical movie versus an SVOD film, is something that we're all playing with and is going to play out over the next little while. And not every movie will need to be at the cinema, and it won't be the home for every movie. The biggest concern really, well, I've got two big concerns, but the first is that the government doesn't seem to be valuing the Australian nature of content, that at 30%, you know, it's largely similar to the 30% you can get, isn't it, with the location 16.5 plus the top up. So what we're being told is that we're really as valuable as an offshore production. And we know from experience from looking around the world that an industry needs to be fueled from the inside out, that global productions can come in and out based on exchange rates changing and the offset being higher in Venezuela, suddenly everyone goes there. So I think that this is a really core problem. The second one is about the way the SVODs potentially could eradicate the production community itself and become just direct hirers, employers on productions. But maybe I can go into that a little later. But those are my big concerns.
Claire, shall I throw to you to moderate this next session as we sort of drill down a little bit more on the impact into production
Yep. So Joel, what do you think this means for the supply going forward?
Well, I think it's definitely going to make it more challenging. You know, to Emil's point, every single Australian feature that we've ever been involved in has been an immense mountain to climb to get it financed, even at 40%. So I'm very worried about drilling this down now to 30% and what that means. I mean, it's a pretty unique situation with the number of films where you see producers having to reinvest their fees just to get these projects made. I mean, we don't have any other, I can't think of a lot of other environments where producers are called on to do that sort of thing, or business owners, so to speak. And as well as the fact that providing surety to producers about what they're going to have is absolutely critical. The reality is that, you know, I'm not sure that films like The Dry, in fact, I know a film like The Dry would not have been made if 30% was all that was available. It simply wouldn't have got up. And I think the majority of the other films that we're involved with now wouldn't have either. And to the point that Claire made earlier, that, you know, right now we're in this environment where things are changing a lot. There is this discussion about what is content, what content is suitable for the big screen versus the small screen, what's television, what's theatrical. And it's an important conversation for us to have as we've seen this boom in television. But what is without question is that there's a reason that the studios have moved all their content to later in the year until it's a more COVID-safe environment globally. And that is that the best way to monetize major theatrical films is still starting at the theatrical window. That's the reason they've done it. Or all of those movies would probably be available now on platforms. So they're all waiting to do that until we have a more normalized theatrical environment. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this: we are seeing attrition without question in terms of the volume of films that are available for theatrical. We have one less studio now. You know, 20th Century Fox has been acquired by Disney. Studios are experimenting with different ways to bring different types of content to audiences, whether it's via platforms and things like that. And so that is creating gaps in the release schedule. And we started to notice this before COVID, but it's absolutely going to be a reality. So at exactly the point when there is more opportunity for films to thrive, for Australian films to thrive theatrically in a slightly less condensed environment, and that's exactly the time we're making it harder for filmmakers to prepare films for theatrical release. And, you know, we at Roadshow work in a particular niche. We try to find films that we believe can secure a really large audience. That's what we do. But it's an ecosystem that suits a lot of different work. And, you know, I think that we will just see it becoming more and more difficult for filmmakers to mount major releases. And it's not just, by the way, the 40% to the 30%. It's also the eradication of the Gallipoli clause. All of these challenges are going to make it harder. And I'm not certain where that additional 10% is going to come from. I can't see it clearly at this point.
Well, I can't see it coming from distributors having to up their minimum guarantees in an even more risky environment. And we've already seen the erosion of sources of ancillary returns to distributors. So it's not necessarily going to come from the market in that way. I'm unsure how it comes from private investors, particularly if the so-called push is to look to online and platforms as homes and destinations for our films, because the one thing private investors want is an equation between risk and reward, and that pretty much goes, you know, in finance plans that are geared towards streamers where you have no access to back end and no accountability or reporting. It's not going to come necessarily from the producer because our overheads are now going to be capped. So, and that was another means in which we used to fill that gap. And that gap is, which traditionally always it was around 10 to 15% of any given budget, has now jumped to 25%. So we all look to Screen Australia. It was very interesting hearing Graham Mason's comments yesterday. It seemed pretty unclear as to how Screen Australia might be allocating to fill that gap, but it certainly throws open the question now, is Screen Australia, and not necessarily the market, really going to be the gatekeeper now determining the kind of films that we might have going forward? Anyway, interesting question. I realise we're getting pretty close to the time where it would be great to bring in some questions from the audience as we continue this conversation. So the question that seems to have really got up to the top of the list is, what steps should we as an industry take to make sure we still rake in similar numbers once Hollywood movies start releasing here again? So, Joel, and Claire, did you both want to have a response to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that positioning, and Claire mentioned this earlier, making choices regarding dating and being highly strategic about when and how you're taking a film into the marketplace will remain critical. I think we all expect to see at some point a major rush from these films that have been delayed entering the marketplace. So, we will see an onslaught of, giant movies heading into the market, but that will also only be temporary because production, as we all know, is quite lumpy on a global basis at the moment. So I think being tactical about how films are released will remain critical. I think we also need to acknowledge, and this is the point, there needs to be a portfolio of local productions. It's not fair to expect every single Australian film to be a giant box office hit. That doesn't happen in any market, in any sector of the business. It's about having a portfolio, and it's about having distributors that are encouraged to take risks and to be ambitious in terms of ensuring that the films are presented in a way that they can compete. And, I would just underline what Claire said earlier. The support that we had from exhibition on a movie like The Dry didn't happen because of COVID. I mean, we first introduced exhibitors to The Dry in 2019. We showed them the first 10 minutes of the movie. The movie was barely out of production, and we had an amazing response. And we had exhibitors completely committed to the film back then. It's not a COVID thing. COVID has probably just extended the longevity of the film, and the same for Penguin and the same for other movies that are performing in the marketplace. But I would suggest that the key need in order to ensure that we continue to have this success is for filmmakers to be able to make great work and for them to be able to make work that is competitive, in order for distributors then to be able to figure out a way to get it to the screen and to be ambitious with their release plans and receive that support from exhibition.
Right. Joel, with all of this, is it changing the shape of your development slate and the kind of features, or in fact, are you still going to be doing features going forward? And if so, what kind of features? And could you actually get Lion financed under the current proposed legislation?
Well, Lion's probably a question for Emil because it's his.
Yeah, that's what I said, Emil.
Emil.
Oh, Joel, sorry, I meant Emil.
Oh, sorry.
My mistake.
I'm not sure I was listening to the question as attentive.
No, Emil, my question to you was, in this kind of environment, does it affect your development slate? What kind of movies have you got in development, and could you actually get Lion up under the proposed? Yeah,
it is. I mean, I think the last few years have seen a reduction, just as television has gotten, firstly the SVODs, and before that the cable channels, and the challenge from television to cinema has meant that the standard of films, what you need in order to get people to decide to go to the cinema, has gotten higher and higher, and it keeps going higher. And as we talked about in the pre-discussion for this, if you manage to crack it and you're Australian, then the rewards are there because they're probably, less competition certainly now. But I think it is genuinely harder and harder, and we need to see theatrical as just a small part, a key part, but a part of what a production company is focused on, that we need to broaden the idea of what content is. I started off as a film producer, theatrical film producer. Now I see our business as being making great content, dramas and some comedies across television, film that might suit an SVOD platform, and theatrical. And what becomes theatrical is just more and more the bullseye. Would Lion have gotten funded? Would we have managed to put together the money? I think, producers are a crafty lot, and we would have managed somehow. But I think the question is, would it have been at the same budget? Would it have had the same international punch? It managed to really achieve that bullseye where it was an Australian story done at a decent budget of about 12 US, but where it was able to have enough cast and enough punch internationally to really cut through. We definitely going to need someone to come in, and I think it's the government's role. It was always the government's role. We were really, I don't think we really had an industry, did we, that had consistent films with 40% essentially playing the role of the government. We always needed Screen Australia for feature films. I mean, there were some that didn't, but largely they did, and I don't think that changes, and I think they're just going to have to adjust their policy. But there'll be less theatrical feature films, so maybe they can use, you know, money more sparingly.
Well, actually, as a question has come in, what policy settings and percentages would you advocate if you could design the offset?
Well, the biggest threat, I think, in the medium term, and this is just stepping back a tiny bit, is that the biggest threat is, okay, let's imagine the SVODs do come in and they really want to make Aussie content. And I think that's likely to happen. And I think we should have quotas, and that's going to be great for us. But they could do it without the Australian production houses and the production community. And if that happens and we all become employees for Hollywood, I think that will gut the industry, because I think in the end of the day, it's the production houses who are on the ground, are loyal to the industry. We are working with the writers and the talent. We know what works here. We have the human capital and the other forms, relationship capital. And so the government, if I was restructuring it, would be restructuring the incentives to help fuel and empower the production houses, who can then go to the SVODs and to all the, you know, global financiers with some leverage. And, you know, if we have a booming sector from the inside out, we're going to find that that just has massive, it pays just massive dividends. If it just becomes, okay, you know, an SVOD comes in and they decide to make an Aussie show and hires a writer and a director who give up all their rights, and there's no connection with an Australian company, that's, you know, we'll limp along, and I'm sure they'll do some Aussie stuff, but that's not really an industry. So I think that's actually the most important thing for the medium term. It's something that is not an emergency yet, but if we get the levers wrong now, it's going to become an emergency in 3 to 4 years.
Absolutely. Claire, can you just talk a little bit about exhibition and just looking forward a little bit into the future? What kind of changes can you see in this space, and how that may impact on Australian films going forward?
I think I personally don't want to see Australian films being relegated to great Australian films being relegated to SVOD services, which have a perceived value of free, because they do deserve to be seen on the big screen. I like Emile, I want it to be ground up. I think that's the most important thing, is we have to have a really healthy production part of the industry to feed all of that, so that there is different ways of doing things. I think cinemas, we are nothing if not trying to pivot into whatever the next iteration of cinema is and film is, and the dreaded word content, which seems to kind of encapsulate everything from TikTok right through to amazing Australian films like The Dry, which is hideous. But we have to learn how to work together better. How can exhibition help production? When can we get involved? I mean, we're always asking for, you know, bits and pieces of production so that we can start social earlier. We can let people know that there's these amazing productions happen before the major campaigns happen. And I think that Screen Australia have been very supportive of that and trying to get that stuff for us, as have, you know, the local distributors. So it's going to be tough, I think, but we have to get our house in order so that we have a really healthy environment, and we can continue supporting Australian stories. I think it's culturally very important, and we have the talent here, we have the infrastructure here, we have everything here that we need to make a successful Australian film industry and have things that are relatively more consistent. And cinemas want to help. We are begging for it. We want that content on screen. And understandably, some films are going to be made for SVOD services and some films are going to be more elevated. But I mean, if the SVOD services are kind of encroaching on what theatrical films will be and things are going to SVOD, then why can't we have a piece of the series pie? Like, why can't we show series in television, in cinema? There's a whole bunch of things that we just need to throw at the wall and see what sticks. I think that we have to start being innovative and partner together better. I think Roadshow have been a great partner. I can't speak highly enough of the team at Roadshow and what we seem to have achieved together in all aspects of release. So it's partnering.
So one of the great opportunities then could in fact be increased dialogue right along the value chain between producers, distributors and exhibitors to come out of this whole situation. Because it's striking that our industry to date has had very few opportunities, apart from the annual movie convention, which many producers don't attend, but for that dialogue where producers can actually speak to the front of house, if you like, the exhibitors from right around the country. So this is another, an opportunity ahead of us. Let's just cutting to the questions. We have a question from Kirsten. Does the current situation make a case for quotas or stronger support to ensure screen space for Australian films when Hollywood returns? Do we need to create a quota system in cinemas?
I'm happy to have a crack at this. I don't think so. At the end of the day, simply having screen space is not going to make your film successful. What's going to make your film successful is if there is a sense of real urgency for people to make the decision that they're going to go to the cinema to see the film. And I think that level of urgency, that level of must experience it at the cinema, is the critical thing that is needed when conceptualizing and developing for the big screen. Now, it's possible and it's doable, but to the point about this content explosion, we all know how much amazing content is out there. We all know that if you're paying for multiple SVOD services, you've got access to this ridiculous volume. So what is going to actually make you go to the cinema? Well, one, a need to get outside occasionally and experience something in a social environment. But the other reason is because of a level of urgency and a desire to capture that experience in a cinema on a big screen. My view is simply putting films on screen is not enough. They've got to be films that have a real audience. And films like The Dry, like Penguin Bloom, like Rams, like High Ground, like Lion, they're going to thrive in any environment. And I'm not sure that they need quotas. And I'm not sure that necessarily smaller films that have failed, or even large budget Australian films that have failed, are going to have an improved life simply because there's been a quota system to manage them in.
So, Joel, this begs the question about diverse voices, new ideas, cultural films, films with new talent, again at the risky end of the spectrum, often on smaller budgets. Where will these kind of films fit going forward, and is cinema still the place for these kind of films? And also a question just referring to specific genres such as horror.
Well, I think it's an ecosystem, and I think my view is that there is still a variety of different types of films that can work in cinemas. Generally, your expectation for a film that is positioned more in the upmarket space, you're not necessarily going to have an expectation of the sort of box office that The Dry might do, and that's perfectly fine. Being realistic about those expectations is, I think, important. But it's also, to Emil's point earlier, not every single film is necessarily suited for cinema, but there are a lot that are. And for me, my view is, if we have a production community which wants to tell ambitious stories, they need to have an environment which is going to provide them with the best ability to get those films made. And if we start to make that more difficult, well, we can end up either in an environment, the one which is horrific to me, the one that Emil described, where the SVODs are just simply controlling everything, or it becomes harder to take risk. And this is the big issue for me, in that none of these Australian films that have been successful have been easy to get financed. They've needed support. They've needed support from Screen Australia. They've needed support from the state funding agencies. They've needed committed producers. They've needed distributors who are willing to take risks, and in some cases, foreign sales agents who are willing to take risks, as well as private investment. These are very, very difficult things to manage, very, very difficult things to put together. Reducing the offset is only going to make that more challenging at a time when we should be making it easier and trying to foster these businesses and producers. And what I mean by these businesses, I'm talking about production companies, by being able to foster them and nurture them and help them along their way. And that is the concern.
Great. Well, look, we're getting close to the end of this session, so I just really want to go around the group and ask each of us to comment on what will our business look like after 1st of July over the next 5 years, and will there be anything that will look differently to what we do now? Emil, do you want to kick off?
Well, I think Joel talks about an ecosystem. It is an ecosystem, and it's changing so fast. So it really is very difficult to predict. But it is, the great thing about the SVODs is that you don't need to monetize a certain sort of movie. It doesn't need to appeal to everybody. You can, find niches, you can find your people, you can find your audience, and it does provide a lot of opportunities. So I think that really understanding how the ecosystem works and making sure that we are responsive. No one has a right to make a film or a TV show. We're making something that needs to have some value in a marketplace, which has, before it was just a cinema with a certain number of seats. And so we needed to make things that made sense for that economic environment. And we're entering into a new economic environment with different levers, and we need to, really deeply understand that. So I can imagine an environment where we can make bolder television, which is fantastic, that the boundaries between Australia and international come down a bit. And we've seen that play out, which is really exciting for us. And where theatrical gets harder, but when you crack it, it's as exciting as it's ever been. And hopefully that even if you're in an SVOD movie or an SVOD TV series, there might be a theatrical play on that as well for part of the marketing, promotion, could be financial, but hopefully, we'll find a way to make it all work and for shows to be able to be seen by the most number of people.
Great. Claire, just really quickly.
I think not a lot will change immediately, but I think over the next 5 years there'll be a lot more innovation in cinema, a lot more different ways in cinemas that you can view films, and I think Australian cinemas are at the forefront globally of change in cinema and how you view films your way in cinema.
Fantastic. And Joel?
Well, we're going to continue to expand the way we think about producing content. We now make television as well as film, and that's something new for us and something we're really enjoying. So we're broadening out what we're doing, but I would say that we are, if anything, we're doubling down on making more Australian films because we see the opportunity and the environment, the theatrical environment as being incredibly opportune. So we're developing more, and having a successful Australian film is it's probably the most satisfying thing you'll ever do in this business. So we're very very hungry to repeat the experience. So we're doubling down.
Fantastic. Look, you've been an amazing, amazing panel. Thank you so much for joining this discussion. And this is something that we want to open up going forward to the industry. I think today, loud and clear, there's a lot of optimism still for the place of Australian movies in cinemas, but we have to fight for it going forward. So watch this space. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Congratulations to everyone on some really great discussions over the course of the day. Particularly important session right now about feature films. I loved it. Thank you guys for being so passionate about what's a really important medium, and we'll be continuing those conversations in Canberra over the next few weeks. There have also been some really big announcements today, including SBS launching an incubator program for emerging screenwriters. And just then we also heard in another session about a great initiative from ABC and Bus Stop Films to support screen careers of people with disabilities. Great to also be hearing from all of our commissioning partners about this, actually. The movie's on, and it's great to see us move from talking about inclusion to actually doing it. And I should really point out, because I think it's been missing from the conversation, how well reality TV programming has been going in this space for a while now, from The Voice to MasterChef to My Kitchen Rules. Right now, I'm loving Eureka and 10's Amazing Race, really showcasing Australia this season. Check it out for casting and what I think is an incredible result. Now, this morning I announced our daily poll for the day about what reform you would like most to see for the industry to be able to produce more Australian content. And the options were increased funding for screen agencies, retention of the 40% offset for feature films, scripted and documentary, talked about in that last session, an expenditure requirement for SVODs and AVODs, increased funding for the ABC and SBS, or finally, retention of strong regulation of legacy broadcasters. And not to want to make particularly friends or enemies with this conversation going forward, but the winner is SVOD and AVOD regulation, but following tightly behind it is the retention of 40% for feature films. So there's a real push from our industry about both those measures. Now, it's my opportunity to then now throw awkwardly to our partners who are involved in some of those broader conversations. Good thing here at SPA we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I want to once again thank everyone who's been critical to bringing this conference to life here at the end of day 2. First up, our principal partner, Screen Queensland, with the Queensland Government. Our major partners are the City of Gold Coast and Screen Australia, and our key industry partners, the ABC, Amazon Prime Video, Media Super, Netflix, SBS, Screenwriters and YouTube. And of course, all our supporting partners, thank you. We have a really big day tomorrow. We've got formats, we've got AI, script writing, William Horberg, Franklin Leonard, streaming, lots about our kids, and finishing with Foxtel's The End and Nude Tuesdays, not together. Kind of weird because it will be Thursday tomorrow. But anyway, that's it from me. I'm off again to the virtual bar. Cheers, offline. Here we go. And I'm not going home. I'm just going to sit here and drink here with Claire in the background. Enjoy yourselves. Make sure you have a drink on us if you can. Don't use those Uber Eats vouchers wisely. And I'll be seeing you all tomorrow. Have a great evening.
Let's go.
And action.